The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. Welcome to the 5th official movement of Pictures at an Exhibition, the Dance of the Chicks in Their Shells. This movement is prefaced by yet another promenade, the 4th this time, and after the big stomping movement of Bydlo, which, as you'll recall, depicted a huge ox cart rumbling its way through the Polish countryside, Mussorgsky seems to be in a contemplative mood as he walks away from that painting to the next painting. Perhaps he's brought back to the whole question of mortality and the loss of his friend, or maybe he just has the blues for whatever reason. But if we really are interpreting these promenades as reactions to the paintings, as Mussorgsky walks from one to the other, then this reaction is one that seems rather calm and sad. We finally get away from the key signature of 5 sharps. As you'll recall, we were going back and forth between G flat minor and B major. And in fact, this key signature here wasn't even written in the original manuscript. Down here, Rimsky-Korsakov has noted that he was the person who put in the key signature of D minor. But let's not forget that this piece was written, as I've said before, in a white heat. So that's a detail that Mussorgsky might have fixed later. We start off quite high, actually, ottava for the right hand, and things slowly descend, sort of starting halfway through the melody. If we were to interpret it in D minor, it would start off just like this. Bum, 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 bum. Notice the minor third there at the end. But here it just starts bum, 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 and so on. So we have the 2 missing beats here, signifying the loss of that part of the melody. But then Mussorgsky adds 2 more beats, which is how we get to 7/4 here. He wants a dramatic pause at the beginning of both of these phrases. And what we're left with is a beautiful chorale. Here things separate out into octaves once again, as the left hand takes over the melody, as we've seen before, and the right hand comments from above in a little bit of counterpoint. This is rather nice right in here. Here we see a little bit of foreshadowing, and you'll hear that in the orchestration as well, of a more mysterious, possibly even slightly macabre turn of events. As I said, perhaps Mussorgsky is contemplating his own mortality, and Mussorgsky could really get morbid when he wanted to. Let's not forget that he was the composer of Night on Bald Mountain, and the Songs and Dances of Death, and several other pieces, and even in this suite itself, we will be delving into the question of death and evil and so on. So, after the right hand picks up the melody, it sort of evolves out of its motion. We have a couple of little octave notes on A's. With a sudden interruption, his eye seems to glimpse the next painting. Then 2 more octave notes, setting up a taka, attaching the end of this to Dance of the Chicks in Their Shells. But let's have a listen to the piano version of this opening promenade. Then we'll also have a look at how Ravel orchestrated it, before we go on to look at the actual movement of Ballet of the Chicks in Their Shells. Now here across this page of orchestration, covering that entire promenade, we see, as I said before, Ravel's very simple approach. Let's take a look at the orchestra numbers for this promenade. 3 flutes, 2 oboes, no English horn, 2 clarinets and bass clarinet, 2 bassoons and contrabassoon, 2 horns, first and third, triangle, of which we see a single note right here, harp, just a little touch at the end, and strings. Ravel takes a very simple and direct approach with the orchestration, nonetheless inspired. Flutes pretty much take the right hand, trading over here in third flute to the same note here. Notice these are clarinets in B flat now, rather than A. And as third flute transitions to first clarinet, the bassoons come in at the bottom in a quite high position here. This is an E for the second bassoon and a B flat for the first bassoon. The next phrase goes to the oboes, with bassoons underneath, and as the first bassoon climbs in its function, we see the clarinet and bass clarinet coming in, providing some of the middle voice there. These notes here on bass clarinet are going to cover a middle octave here, playing 1 octave higher than the second bassoon, as the first bassoon covers some of the harmonic duties right below the first oboe. Now you may recall that in the piano version, the left hand took over the melody at that point. And indeed, here we see first bassoon and contrabassoon doubling in octaves with the low strings, answered from above, in this case by the horns playing octaves. Ravel had a tendency to default to first and third horn, which he didn't really need to. Some second horn players have felt that this is actually not the greatest approach to take. Some of these octaves could have been possibly more easily just covered by using the pair of first and seconds. That was just Ravel's choice. But I would probably score first and second horn here just because they are more simpatico with each other, and second horn is just more accustomed to playing things like this, octaves with the first. It's really better to save the third for, say, doubling A2 above along with the first horn, or trading off higher, more out front passages and so on. But this will work fine, don't get me wrong. It's just maybe less than ideal. If you really think about it, maybe this could go into Ravel's book of errors, right, that he wanted to write. As the horns reach up, they are taken over by octaves in flutes, oboes, and clarinets, all doubled together. It's really quite a thick sound, something that you should listen for, in case you're wondering how that would work in your own scoring. And here the flutes change to A2 above and third flute below, but really it's just the same exact strategy, with bass clarinet filling in a third octave below, as the upper strings come in and play a triple octave. So the first and second violins are going to be doubled each by 3 or 4 wind instruments apiece, whereas the violas are going to only be doubled by the bass clarinet, but that's quite good enough in terms of doubling. Here, as the melody rises an octave, we see a number of different strategies that help the players position themselves into different places. The most notable of which is the bass clarinet that simply takes up the same notes as the bassoons. This is a unison, right? So written B below the staff, think down a ninth, and you get the same A as the bassoons are playing. But let's talk about that octave. Here we have it scored out exactly as it's written for the violins. Here the third flute just jumps up 2 octaves to that high A, because Ravel knows that nobody's going to hear third flute if it's positioned at the same place as the clarinets and oboes. And here it's simply a case of telescoping these octaves into A2 on the same note. So really, 3 flutes above, and then A2 oboes and clarinets below. And you get a really wonderfully thick sound. And what's happening an octave below that? We have the violas being doubled by a single horn, and that works out perfectly well. As far as the octaves are going in the bassoon family and the lower strings, the lower strings have got it all written out, just like before, but you'll notice that wherever possible, the second bassoon takes over the lower octave to double very firmly with the contrabassoon, then goes back to A2 when things get too low. And this is a beautiful, dense piece of Russian-style orchestration, which you'll probably notice when we listen to it in a minute. Then we have a little rest, and then some harmonics from the low strings. This is simply the cello playing its A string and then adding the octave harmonic, whereas this is playing an A on the D string and then shifting very quickly over to a harmonic. Interesting that the first bassoon covers both of these pitches, this one here and then the harmonic as it jumps into that same place, which is very fun. Then on the other side, we've got both the cellos and the double basses playing an octave higher than written. And this is also an octave higher than written because these are both harmonics. Now, something you're going to notice when you hear this is that this is a better idea written and perhaps thought of, and maybe even played on some sound sets, than it works practically. When you do harmonics in octaves like this, the bottom harmonic tends to interfere with the top harmonic. You may notice that in the orchestral recording. Now, in between these two very cool ways of playing simple A octaves, the dance of the chicks in their shells starts to interfere with its own promenade, as if it just cannot wait to get started. I like to think of this as the tiny flash of light, or flash of color, that Mussorgsky sees as he is walking towards the painting, that interrupts his mood of solemnity with the promise of new life, right? And I will wait until we analyze the movement itself, rather than unpacking this now. But you can just see that it's first flute on top, the oboes and first clarinet in the middle, and a little bit of harp, along with a little ting on the triangle. That's all you need to know for now. So let's have a listen to this, and really listen to see how effective you feel those octave harmonics are. That's something that I feel is not the most successful way of scoring it. Also, listen for these very searching octaves in the scoring here, and listen for that moment where the melody leaps up an octave, and how the timbre seems to coalesce as the color becomes more straightforward with the flutes on top, the reeds in the middle, and the first horn at the bottom. And then, of course, all the other things that we talked about. This lovely tripling on these octaves over the very somber bassoon family and lower strings with the horns coming in. And then these little chorales here with the flutes plus the clarinets and a touch of bassoon at the end. Then the oboes plus the bassoons with a touch of clarinet and bass clarinet at the end. And I'll see you on the next screen as we backtrack to look at the original piano score to the Dance of the Chicks in Their Shells. And now, finally, here we are at movement 5. Ballet of the chicks in their shells, literally. So this is a scherzino, which is usually a term that is given to fast 3/4 movements, like a scherzo. Essentially, a scherzino is a little scherzo. Scherzos kind of go back to the term scherz or joke, right? It's meant to be somewhat lighthearted and fun and funny, although when you look at some of the scherzos of Beethoven, they can be anything but funny, really. But on top of that, we have lively and graceful. So those are things worth thinking about. And also una corda. This whole movement is meant to be soft pedaled all the way through. And it does have a trio, just like a scherzo, but it's a scherzo in 2/4. This is the first movement for which we actually have the existing painting by Victor Hartmann. And it's something worth talking about for just a minute. This was a costume design from a ballet called Trilby, for which Hartmann apparently did some set design and costume design. And it's just wonderfully absurd. This is not really a painting for its own sake. It's more of just a costume design sketch from which the costumier would design the actual apparatus that the children would wear when dancing that particular part of Trilby. And of course, this music has nothing to do with the actual score to Trilby, but it's just what was inspired in Mussorgsky when he saw those sketches at the exhibition. We don't really know what paintings Mussorgsky might have seen already by Victor Hartmann. The ones that he focused on musically might have been paintings that Hartmann had already shown Mussorgsky long before, or they could have been things that Hartmann had talked about to Mussorgsky for which he did not actually have the painting at hand. He might have described a painting in great detail to Mussorgsky, who would have just been really desperate to know what it looked like. So we really don't know, and in fact, since about half of these paintings we don't really even have, right? We're up to number 5, and we finally have the first painting worth talking about. We just really don't know. And it's a shame that nobody thought to preserve the paintings that Mussorgsky covered in his suite. But as I said before, nobody really knew that this would be even greater than Hartmann's works someday down the line. So nobody thought to set aside those paintings that Mussorgsky had put into this suite. And Mussorgsky himself made the situation worse by shelving this great piano work. So as a result, those paintings are lost forever, it seems. Unless one of them turns up in somebody's attic, or maybe 2 or 3, let's hope, someday. So speaking of which, back to the piano score. We can see it's got very simple construction. Little grace-noted chords in the right hand, going back and forth between almost exactly the same chords in the left hand. So here we have grace note going to an F chord, echoed by an F chord in the left hand, and then grace note going to what is essentially an F diminished chord, trading off with a D flat major chord. And so on. I could analyze the harmony for you and go through it, but we just really don't have time. It's a rather absurd little piece of music, and that's intentional. It's just meant to shake Mussorgsky's bad mood after seeing Bidlow, for whatever reason. It's also extremely simple music. We see this little rising line here that gets chromatic here and there, with little grace-noted thirds dancing along on top of it, turning into chords, which turn back into the opening idea. Same thing again. And what's lovely here is that we have the music essentially rising chromatically, and as it does, we have the little thirds chittering above, and this is the funnest part for me, I think. these alternating thirds, which are ascending semi-chromatically. In other words, the root note is chromatic, but it's not maintaining its identity as major thirds all the way up. So we have the bottom part of a C major chord and then the top part of a C major chord as we step through a D flat major third and then a D sharp minor third and so on, and then an F major third and a G flat major third. And then this essentially works enharmonically as an A flat minor third, although it's really written out as a B natural, and so on. But I love this yum 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 bum. So think about that high D flat and how you might orchestrate it. The choice really seems obvious here, doesn't it? That this beautiful, light, lively scoring is going to end up being scored on winds. But which combination of winds is going to be used for this very piercing D flat here? Something to think about. And then the trio is just deliciously silly, with all these little, almost quacking, twittering trills. And this lovely little timekeeping in the bass. And then this is a very cutely quacking, chirping melody right here. Da capo il scherzino without the trio, then to the coda. So just goes back to the top here. And then obviously the musician will figure out just to go to that high D flat. I don't know if that's really D flat. I don't have perfect pitch. And then there's a little answer. So yeah. And this is meant to attach to the next movement, which is kind of fun. But we will get to that when we get to that. So you can see it's pretty simple all the way through. All the same, it really puts the lie to the stereotype that Mussorgsky was just a composer of very clumsy, thick, single-minded scoring, right? So far in this suite, and we're about halfway done, we have seen some very thick scoring, and we've seen that scoring interpreted by Ravel in all due style. And yet we've seen other moments that are lovely and nimble and joking and lighthearted and really show other sides to Mussorgsky's approach. And there are also many other sides to Mussorgsky. He had this beautiful lyrical side that we see in some of his other music. And he had this lovely echoing phrasing sometimes where he would score everything in pairs of phrases. And there's this wonderful logic to it that doesn't feel repetitive. So let's have a listen to this piano score really quickly. And you'll notice all the repeats, some of which are actually written out fully by Ravel, so that the repeat is different, or the da capo is different. So it requires its own scoring, but we'll cover that in a minute. Okay, and now for some real scoring here by Ravel. Very, very fun approach. It's sort of like Ravel scoring circus music. to a degree. So we've got first flute, obviously taking the top line, which is doubled by first oboe. And the oboes in general are covering the harmony, along with first clarinet playing the bottom part of these little F major chords. Now this is itself being doubled by the harp. And notice how this is a form of transcription of piano part onto harp part that is not blatant, right? We've got right-hand chords in the harp and basically just alternating with a single F below and then the occasional G-sharp third. And that's good enough. And then the harp does not even need to participate in these 4 bars. But this lovely little back and forth here by the harp gives it a wonderfully elegant little feeling. Notice how Ravel is emphasizing the second beat of every second bar with just a dash of cymbal, which I think also works really great together with the harp in this context. And with pizzicato in the first and second violins, playing divisi. And then, in between each of these phrases, we have that very clownish rising line that becomes chromatic at the end. Pizzicato in violas at first, and then second violins afterwards. And notice the little plucks at the beginning of each little phrase of melody. As this rises, we see doubling on bassoon, giving right over on this fairly high B flat to second oboe, and these little rising thirds jump over to first clarinet on top, but it's the same basic scheme. Then flutes come in right at the end, and the whole thing starts up again. On the second page, things are a little bit more complex, because, as we remember, the piano part changes a little bit. So it's alternating every other bar between violas and second violins, and then when the little thirds start, they are continued to be alternated all the way up to the first violins. And this is all doubled by bassoon, trading off with oboe, back and forth. And this is where I feel the bassoon is at its funnest, as it's doubling this pizzicato down here in staccato, rising higher and higher. And as things start to get a little high for the bassoon, the horn takes over and is really able to add a lot of oomph. This is really neat how this works in here with these little pium pium, and then answered by pium 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 pium, right? And those higher thirds are doubled by harp, which gives it a beautiful sound, especially with this simple of a texture. When you have extremely simple textures like this, you can add little touches to it that make a huge difference, whereas in huge, grandiose scoring, you add a little touch like this and it just is completely lost, right? So that's what's lovely about this movement for me, is how stripped down it is. So it makes it very simple to use extremely effective single little touches, like the harp here and on the previous page. But yeah, oboe doing the thirds back and forth with clarinet, that's really fun. Flutes coming in, back and forth with oboes, and then both flute and oboe doubling, answered by oboes and clarinets doubling from below. And then we have this hugely penetrating high D-flat note, played by all 3 groups of instruments, flutes, oboes, and clarinets. Then there's just this tiny little ba-dum right at the end of octave Cs. So remember, we were sort of wondering what wind instrument was going to be playing this, and now you know. All of them that can actually play that note. And that's just a really wonderful sound. Very thick, very piercing, and yet not too obnoxious. I feel that this would be problematic were it played by like a single E-flat clarinet. It just wouldn't culminate the excitement and the energy that is leading up to it, right? But this way, with all of the instruments playing that one high note, it's a bit different. So that's really simple orchestration. I don't think we need to laboriously go over reminding you of every single thing that we talked about to listen to. But I would just say listen to the contrasts between instruments as they trade off, especially as the energy grows. Listen to the contribution of the bassoon, because it's almost as if the pizzicato is doubling the bassoon, and the bassoon is the more interesting prominent instrument, as well as the staccato oboe. I really feel that this is way more about the winds and the occasional horn than it really is about the strings. I think the strings are just adding a little bit of emphasis, but this is really meant to be about the winds. And especially at the beginning here, when we're adding the harp into the mix, along with those very, very lightly played flutes. And we've got hardly any pizzicato at all, except for just a little bit of emphasis. So have a listen to that, and then we will take a look at the trio. Here I feel that Ravel is really doing something clever, and sly in a way. As we'll recall, Ravel loved artifice. Now this is Mussorgsky being inspired by his friend's painting of a costume design that was used for a romantic ballet. Trilby, right? Probably a light piece of fluff, very similar to Delibes and Adam and any number of French and Russian ballet composers. And I really see a heavy influence here of that kind of scoring, but done in a very ironic way. I've studied a lot of ballet scores from that time, from the mid to late 19th century, and there's a certain quality to them, especially with Adam, who scored Giselle, in 2 weeks or something like that. And there's something that's not exactly nourishing about the scoring to those ballets. It's good, solidly crafted, very workmanlike orchestration that sometimes reaches for certain orchestral effects, and we see that in the much more famous and much more long-lasting ballets of Tchaikovsky, who actually felt that Delibes was a much greater ballet composer than himself. And he really labored to bring in lots of different orchestral effects into his own scoring to kind of match these 19th century masters of ballet composition and ballet orchestration. So I'm seeing some of that same approach here with Ravel's work, and I'm sure that he knew the history of what the painting was all about. In fact, there are notes by Stasov that would have been available to Ravel for context about what the paintings were. Stasov was a friend of Mussorgsky and his composers group, the Mighty Five, and he had actually been to the exhibition himself as well. He knew which paintings Mussorgsky was referring to, and he wrote a complete set of notes of what each movement was referring to and what its painting was. And that is priceless for music historians and art historians alike, if anybody were to really try to track down those missing paintings, which I really am afraid that we never will ever find all of them. But anyhow, Ravel would have understood the context of what he was scoring. And I see a lot of that in here, especially in terms of the accompaniment and how it's scored. It just really feels like a page right out of Delibes' Sylvia or Coppelia. Really, the accompaniment is way more interesting than the melody. But the melody's interesting too. But I love this little left-hand piano-like scoring for the bassoon, slurring up to that F, and that's all pretty easy, pretty fun. And then accompanying on the beat, we've got pizzicato in the violas. And underlining the first note of every pair of bars, we've got cellos plucking the same exact note as well, that same F. Meanwhile, we've got this pedal tone right in the middle, holding down the root of the chord, sounding that same F. And that's just so fun. And now, let's talk about the melody. We have these lovely divisi trills played by the violins, and they have this really light, airy 19th century ballet quality about them. So fun. And the beginning of each trill is emphasized by a little tweet by the flutes, right? And right at the end, the violins let go and turn into a clarinet trill. And once again, this is really underlining how bird-like everything is. That little touch right at the end, I think, is just genius. It's very simple, but it is one of those little simple but ingenious touches that Ravel fills his scores with. Now here, you'll notice there is no repeat, right? Ravel has pretty much dispensed with repeats except for repeating the beginning of the piece. So from this point on, all of the repeated parts, including the da capo, are fully scored out. And Ravel doesn't choose to repeat anyways. What he does is he makes the repeat into another piece of scoring, and that helps keep things much more interesting. We have the same trills, exactly as before, the same scheme really, with the clarinets coming in at the end, but we have more things emphasizing. We have the celesta joining in, playing exactly what the flutes did before. And that adds another layer of very tinkly, chiming sound to it, especially when you consider that these pitches will be heard an octave higher than what is scored. This lovely little tinging from above. Meanwhile, the flutes are playing these very effective tremolos. They're going to essentially be flutter-tongued at this speed, each of which release on the second beat into a little staccato that progresses to the next chord where necessary. Very fun, getting very avian. And there's a little bit of help on that middle of the bar beat from alternating between oboes and first clarinet. That also mixes it up and keeps it interesting. Meanwhile, we have the third horn coming in muted as well, and it's taking over the role of the violas here. Pretty much the same exact pitches, only written up a fifth, sounding in its original pitches down a fifth, exactly how the viola is scored. And the viola is taking over the role of the first horn. That's kind of fun. Meanwhile, the first horn goes up an octave and starts playing this slurred staccato, and that also helps keep the motion very lively and not static. We have one touch of percussion here, and that is a very interesting alternating stroke between the percussionist hitting the shell with their left stick and the skin of the snare drum with their right stick, and going back and forth between those two different sounds. That's really, really fun. And then the harpist comes in and starts playing what the bassoon was playing before. Now, it doesn't look that way, but if you work out what is going on here enharmonically, you can see that we've got an E sharp plus an F. So enharmonic unison. So F, F, A. Same thing here. F, F, A. And same pitch as G sharp, and then enharmonic F, B natural. Same thing going on there. Ravel doesn't choose to make this into an enharmonic unison because that's kind of a tricky pedaling just to go from this A to that A flat. There is a danger of hearing the pedal change if the harpist makes it too quick, and it's really just not a good approach anyways to go directly from one note to the next unless you want to make it an effect. Anyhow, it just keeps things simple when you think about it, to not double up every single pitch enharmonically. But the main concern is that those Fs are nice and strong. And Sometimes enharmonic doubling adds just a touch of intonational ambiguity, doubling both of those pitches. One is possibly going to be just a slight hair out of tune with the other, which also gives it an interesting sound. But this underlines even more that sense of tiptoeing around that we got at the beginning with the bassoons and then the middle strings here, pizzicato. The cello keeps up that role of hitting the downbeat every 2 bars. And the second violins come in here and they play these big rolls divisi in triple stops. And some of these are a little weird to negotiate. Really, they're very big chords when you think about it. But they still work out great, and they sound very, very cool. That's enough to analyze for now. Let's have a listen to this and pay attention to all of those elements. Especially how these trilling thirds get bigger here and more garish by adding more and more elements like the celesta and the expanded roll of the winds with the flutter tonguing and the extra little grace notes and so on. And also listen to the difference in the horn between that single held F and then how it comes in an octave higher, playing slurred staccato, with the third horn taking over the role of the violas, and the harp taking over the role of the bassoons. And then, of course, listen for actually a fairly subtle sound of those strums in the second violin, and contrasting the changeover of roles between the violas and the horns here. An accomplished orchestrator should be listening for all of these different changes and touches and subtleties of color all the time. You should be trying to pay attention to all of the little changes. Even if it's something that's kind of obvious, like the violins ending their passage of trilling, trading off with the clarinets. Something like that. But it could also be something that is even subtler, which would be, what is the real effect here of changing between playing on the side of the drum with one stick and the skin of the drum with the other stick, and so on. Because you can bring a lot of these effects into your own scoring, right? So listen for all of those subtleties and obvious touches, and we'll take a look at the second half of the trio. Here on this next screen, Ravel takes that 19th century approach way past anything that anybody did, including Tchaikovsky, and it's still in very subtle, very spare scoring. Ravel really was a master, and it's so fun to uncover jewel-like pages, like these 2 pages here that I've got on the screen. There's just so much to unpack, and yet it's so simple. We've got alternating octave Fs here played in harmonics, and then violas playing a very easy, very effective F 2 octaves above this with artificial harmonics. Second violins taking over the role of pizzicato that we saw in the violas before, with the cellos still holding down those Fs every other bar. And that is the motor that drives this particular page, along with the bassoon, which is back to its role of playing the entire left hand of the original piano score. And add to that, we've got little tweets here by the piccolo, sounding an octave higher, of course, so they're coming in at a third above the oboe, right here on this D flat, and then just maintaining that position as the melody moves around. And it's so cute, really. I mean, the painting is pretty cute already, but this is just really cute scoring, but not in a cloying way, but just like really fun and silly. And very, very bird-like, once again, of high oboe, very thin, very fun. We're warned about the fact that the oboe gets thinner as it gets higher, and of course that can be a strength as well when it's in this context, right? And this is extremely cool. This is masterful, this little touch here. of the first oboe slurring up to F and the second oboe coming in at an octave below, right? What is achieved by this? Well, you get the octave reinforcement, and if there is any kind of squeaking or anything like that, it'll be compensated by the second oboe playing the octave below. And then, because that second oboe is in that position, it can take over the A flat very, very smoothly and naturally. And then the second oboe can come in and just do its thing once again. And then we can throw in this F once again for that second oboe to kind of help tie things up. And now look how all of these roles change as we go into the scored out repeat. As you recall from the piano score, this was just a repeat. But here Ravel expands it to this wonderful clamor of birds sort of clucking and chirping at each other. So let's look at how all of those roles change. Very, very fun. So first of all, harp is just turning their right hand into F octaves. And essentially, this pitch here is going to be the same as this one here. These pitches are going to be doubled by pizzicato second violins. So essentially, these are just really covering those same pitches as the harp, except for, of course, that bottom part of this octave. The second violin part here is jumping over to the cellos, and this is actually a nice place to bring the cellos in, covering that line, because they are going to have the most projection in pizzicato. By having the violas take that role first, and then the second violins, and then saving the cellos for last, we avoid having that greater sense of projection, those longer twangs of pizzicato. And the violas can just take over, emphasizing the F on every single bar this time. It's also a good match for second horn, once again doubling that role. And this time the first horn doesn't mess around with any of that slurred staccato stuff. It's just playing repeated C's, sounding F down a fifth. But we still have bassoon playing the first two notes of each group, and that is also extremely effective. Clarinet is taking over tweeting on the F, an octave lower than the piccolo, but the piccolo is jumping in and playing an octave higher. Here we have tremolo dental, so in other words, the flutist is buzzing their tongue right at the tip of the teeth as they're playing these little flutter-tongued staccatos. And meanwhile, the first oboe has taken that high F that we heard before and is just riding it with all of these beautiful overtones that are going to be touched on by the piccolo above and the flute an octave below. And second oboe is just dancing back and forth in octaves between these Fs. And that pretty much covers everything except for the melody and the percussion. And here the melody is just being played by first violins. And here is where the melody is going to feel at its strongest. And that is because this is really just a stripped down sound, right? We have very few instruments playing at once at any given time doing any particular role. And here the roles are spread out with very, very delicate scoring. And Ravel has not really marked forte here or anything. So a single line of first violins is going to be very strong, very impactful in that texture. And they can actually overplay from time to time, which I've heard happen occasionally in performances of this, that the violins can get a little too loud. Behind that, we just have this lovely percussion, a tish of cymbal on every downbeat, doubling that pizzicato in the violas, the back and forth between the shell and the drum head in the snare drum, and then a little ting on the triangle, doubling these high piccolo notes. And you put that all together, and you get wonderful textures. I feel this is very nimble. It's almost like the melody in the oboe tiptoeing through a very hazardous situation, and then a big reaction of clucking and chirping and so on coming from the rest of the birds here. We don't need to go over every single thing to listen for. You'll remember that. Let's have a listen to it now. And then we'll check out the recap, which is very much like the beginning. And now we're finally back to the beginning. And you will notice, if you've been observant, that these 12 bars are exactly the same as the first 12 bars of this movement, note for note. There is not one single difference anywhere. And Ravel really could have put a da capo on this, at least for this particular part. But it's all completely written out, and I would say that actually just helps the player. It's really such a short section, and their eye can just keep moving down the page rather than having to jump back. And it's also convenient for the conductor, too. They can just keep leafing forward in their score and not have to bookmark or put a little paper clip or a little tab or dog-ear their score. Moving to the next page, we see the same strategies, of course. Oboes trading off with the clarinets, and bassoons trading off with the oboes as they're doubled by pizzicato on that rising line. And pretty much the same thing happening here. Pyum, 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 bum. Now here, the D flats are just a little bit different. We've got A2 flutes on that high D flat, but here we've got octaves in the oboes with first bassoon and first horn doubling the bottom note of that octave. And then, of course, clarinets are still playing that high note. So it's a much more impactful, much more intense sound here, especially with that added edge of horn doubling the first violin pizzicato. Then we have that little release there, same note, little tweet between first oboe and first flute. And then the little reaction, ending very simply rather than grandly. Just a little pizzicato from the violins, doubling the oboes, and a little 6/4 chord in the flute family, with the piccolo on top in that little tweet of an A. But otherwise, pretty much all the same, but you would do well to have another look at it, I think, and notice some of the things that you noticed before, and see how this pushes towards its culmination in this much more intense D-flat octave here. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next movement of Pictures at an Exhibition, Samuel Goldenberg and Schmoyl.